Welcome, 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 welcome to the Humanists of Greater Portland. We've got a nice crowd here at Friendly House. So many familiar faces and a couple new ones. That's pretty good. And then we got our Zoom crowd. Welcome, Zoom crowd. We're so glad you're here. Want to welcome everybody here to Friendly House. I want to especially welcome anybody that's new. Our meeting today will be recorded and will be archived on the HGP website. You're here at a humanist meeting, and humanism is a philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. Humanists strive to lead fulfilling, meaningful, and ethical lives, and use reason and empathy to guide their decisions and actions. We do this because this is the only life of which we are certain. As humanists, we affirm the dignity and worth of all people. We do this not only for all that humans have accomplished in the arts and science and humanity, but also simply for the possibility of peace and well-being when all people are treated with respect. The Humanists of Greater Portland is under the umbrella of the American Humanist Association. And Pete and Paul are here. They entertained us for about a half an hour this morning before the meeting, and they're going to be, as our tradition, our singers now.
Summer's ends around the bend, just flying. Swimming suits are on the line, just drying. I'll meet you there for our conversation. I hope I didn't ruin your whole vacation. Well, you never know how far from home you're feeling until you watch the shadows on the ceiling. Well, I don't know, but I can see it snowing. In your car, the windows are wide open. Just come on home. Come on home. No, you don't have to be alone. Just come on home. Valentines break hearts and minds at random. That old Easter egg ain't got a leg to stand on. Well, I can see that you can't win for trying. And New Year's Eve is bound to leave you crying. Come on home. Come on home. No, you don't have to be alone. Just come on home. The moon and stars hang out in bars just talking. I still love that picture of us walking, just like that old house we thought was haunted. Summer's end came faster than we wanted. Come on home. Come on home. No, you don't have to be alone. Just come on home. Come on home. You don't have to be alone. Just come on home.
Thank you, Pete and Paul. Your songs just bring us such joy. They really, really do. And just thank you. Just from the bottom of my heart and from all of us. You come here every first Sunday, and you just make these meetings so important. Thank you.
Oh, shucks.
Well, no, it's true. It's absolutely true. So thank you. Okay. Well, I am very pleased to introduce Professor Emeritus Jeff Seward, who has been a frequent, he's been working on a series and has been a frequent presenter here in at our HGP meetings. Jeff, come on in. It's you really an introduction is hardly necessary. You're so famous here.
Well, it's good to be here again. I know a lot of you, and I noticed that among the people watching remotely is a good friend of mine. It used to be my boss, chair of the Department of Politics and Government at Pacific University, Jules Boykoff. Hello, Jules.
Hey, Jeff.
And I'm honored that after hearing me pontificate for years at the university, he's thought it might be worthwhile to come hear me pontificate today about free markets, virtues, vices, and alternatives. You know, we tend to think of market systems like our own as being the natural way of doing things, as being inevitable. But societies haven't always organized themselves by market systems, and we may not always do it in the future. And I wanted to start today with a story from Robert Heilbronner's History of Economics, The Worldly Philosophers. I don't know, has any of you ever read The Worldly Philosophers? I highly recommend it. Very entertaining account of the history of economic thought. So here's the story. We are in Boston in 1644. One Robert Keene is charged with a heinous crime. He has made over 6 profit on the shilling, an outrageous gain. The court is debating whether to excommunicate him for his sin, but it finally relents and dismisses him with a fine of £200 for a 6 profit. Mr. Keene is so upset that before the elders of the church he does, with tears, acknowledge his covetous and corrupt heart. The minister of Boston uses the example of Keene's avarice to thunder forth in his Sunday sermon on some false principles of trade. Among these false principles are these. 1, that a man might sell as dear as he can and buy as cheap as he can. 2, if a man lose by casualty of sea, etc., in some of his commodities, he may raise the price of the rest. 3, that he may sell as he bought, though he paid too dear. All false, 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 cries the minister. To seek riches for riches' sake is to fall into the sin of avarice. 1644. Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, he too was fine with someone selling things they had produced, but denounced making money from money. That is, buying something cheap and then selling it at a profit. He considered that deeply unethical, immoral. The medieval Catholic Church had a similar view, in part based on Aristotle. Today, we take it for granted that prices are legitimately determined by the forces of supply and demand in competitive free markets. But well into modern times, churches and governments held that it was necessary for public authority to establish just prices. To sell at any other price was a crime, and public authorities needed to be constantly on guard to squash selfish profit-seeking. The revolutionary idea of Adam Smith was the claim that you didn't have to regulate individual morality or greed in economic life. Free competitive markets would force economic agents, in order to serve their most selfish self-interest, to be honest and efficient and fair. You didn't have to regulate prices to enforce a just price, and you didn't have to regulate individual morality. In a system of competitive markets, you could let greed and self-interest run wild, and the market would turn those selfish efforts into public good. The market would be a better straitjacket than any church or law could possibly be. How so? Well, in a perfectly competitive market, with all actors possessed of perfect information, if I try to raise my prices above the going rate, customers will shop elsewhere, and I will go out of business. If I try to cheat customers, I will get a bad reputation, and customers will shop elsewhere. If I produce shoddy goods, people will notice pretty quickly and flee to other providers. And if I am inefficient, I'll have to charge higher prices, and that will pretty quickly kill my business. So in this perfect version of markets, my selfish desire to make money will force me to be efficient, honest, and innovative, with no public or religious authority necessary looking over my shoulder to enforce a just price. In this perfect version of markets, the economy as a whole will also be efficient, channeling resources of all sorts to the producers who can make the most efficient, profitable use of those resources. It will also be fair, with all factors of production being rewarded according to their marginal product. Competitive markets can be incredibly powerful and, in a certain sense, incredibly efficient. They more or less, without friction, manage to coordinate millions, even billions of transactions between buyers and sellers every day without requiring massive resources to be spent supervising each transaction to protect against selfish or dishonest profiteering. Within a capitalist framework over the past 2 or 3 centuries, they have helped generate enormous social wealth and dramatic economic growth. The average person today is radically better off materially, at least in the developed world, than the average person was 200 years ago. Moreover, there appears to be an elective, what social scientists call an elective affinity between competitive markets within a capitalist framework and democratic government. As Milton Friedman, the famous free market fundamentalist economist, has put it, the kind of economic organization that provides economic freedom directly, namely competitive capitalism, also promotes political freedom because it separates economic power from political power. Oh, would that it were true. And in this way, enables the one to offset the other. Historical evidence speaks with a single voice on the relation between political freedom and a free market. I know of no example in time or place of a society that has been marked by a large measure of political freedom and that has not also used something comparable to a free market to organize the bulk of economic activity. It is, of course, important to note that while all functioning democracies are located in competitive capitalist economies, Nazi Germany and fascist Italy were also capitalist countries. So was apartheid South Africa. And so are competitive authoritarian systems today, like Putin's Russia or Erdogan's Turkey or Orban's Hungary. Communist China has embraced free markets to a remarkable degree in the last 40 years, but it hasn't moved China much in the direction of democracy. And in recent years, China has actually moved decisively away from the very limited democratic experiments that they briefly engaged in a couple of decades ago. Still, there is something to Friedman's point about an elective affinity between free markets and democracy, but it's also clear that free markets don't guarantee democracy by any means. So with all these good things about markets, what could go wrong? Well, actually quite a lot. First of all, it is actually pretty rare for markets to be anywhere near perfectly competitive. And it is never the case that all economic actors are in instant possession of perfect information. The result is that market economies are absolutely rife with little and large monopolies. The dirty little secret of competitive markets is that while businessmen love to extol the virtues of competition, they actually really hate competition when applied to their own businesses and are engaged in a constant struggle to escape from it. In fact, creating some sort of monopoly for your own business is the key to business success so that you make greater than normal profits. How do you do that? Well, you develop a new product before your competitors, or a more efficient production process, or you corner the market on critical raw materials, or you do better marketing or better packaging, or best of all, you create a popular brand. You can also achieve a monopoly via a patent or a copyright that gives you an exclusive right to produce something or to publish something, or a government-mandated monopoly, or a tariff to protect yourself from foreign competition, or a government subsidy of some kind. So market economies are full of mini monopolies. I was driving around yesterday and I noticed a gas station that was charging $4.47 for gas. I bought gas at Costco for $3.09 the day before. Well, how can that gas station get away with charging $4.47? Well, it's the only gas station for a mile or two in any direction, and so it's got a local monopoly. And just for the convenience, people go there and spend almost $1.50 more for gas. So market economies are full of mini monopolies, or slightly less pernicious, mini oligopolies, in which a small number of firms dominate a sector or a locality. Some of these mini monopolies grow into big monopolies, a handful of giant multinational companies that have managed to escape or diminish competition in a big way. And as every orthodox economist knows, the effect of monopolies and oligopolies is to produce less than the optimal amount of a good and sell it at an artificially inflated price. So much for markets, resulting in an efficient and optimal allocation of resources. Monopolies and oligopolies contradict that promise. Large corporations escape markets in another way. Their internal operations, which may involve vertical integration from the production of raw materials all the way to final products, are not regulated by markets at all. Their internal functioning. They are big bureaucratic organizations with sometimes hundreds of thousands of employees that function internally in some ways very much like centrally planned economies. They have a hard time allocating resources to their various divisions because they don't have market-driven prices inside their operations. Like centrally planned economies, they are constantly engaging in reorganization schemes. Those of you who work for big companies know this. Each new boss comes in with a bright idea to reorganize everything, that alternately decentralize operations to escape bureaucratic pathologies, and then re-centralize operations because the decentralized units are not maximizing central objectives of the company. And since their employees are also not really enmeshed in competitive markets either, large corporations, like centrally planned economies, engage in an endless round of incentive schemes to try to align their employees' interests with the company's interest, with only partial or intermittent success. Most workers today are not very directly linked to competitive markets. At the time of the American Revolution, in the non-slave economy, about 85% of working adults were self-employed, either as independent farmers, independent artisans, or merchants. They had a shop, they were blacksmiths or silversmiths or farmers. Only 15% were employees of someone else, again, outside of the slave economy. Today, those proportions are essentially reversed. Now only about 15% of adults are self-employed, and about 85% are employees of a business or government and are more enmeshed in organizational life than free markets. So however appealing the ideal of free competitive markets is, that ideal does not actually reflect very accurately the economic systems of the real world. There's another big fly in the ointment of free markets that every intro economics textbook describes, and even market fundamentalists like Milton Friedman acknowledge. It's called externalities. This is standard economic theory. Nothing radical here. What is an externality? An externality is a cost of production that is not borne by the producer, but is instead transferred to customers or to the general public. The classic case, the classic example, is pollution. A factory may spew out smoke with hazardous materials that cause major health problems for the nearby population. But markets themselves don't force the polluter to pay those costs. They aren't reflected in the prices of the products they produce because they aren't reflected in the costs of production of the company. Anybody here from Idaho? Ever live in Idaho? Are you familiar with J.R. Simplot? That name ring a bell? For those of you who aren't Idahoans, J.R. Simplot was the potato king of Idaho, who made his a billionaire, who made his original fortune by perfecting a process for freezing French fries and selling them to the US military during World War II. He also was the primary supplier of French fries for McDonald's. He later branched out into all sorts of other kinds of enterprises, including gold mines in Colombia and pig farms in southern Idaho. Back in the 1970s, when he was still alive and I was working for public television in Boise, I had a chance to do a long profile sort of interview with him. And he told the story of how he got in trouble with the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality that cracked down hard on him about the pollution that his big pig farm was generating in the Snake River. He said, "They really made a Christian out of me." But he thought it was kind of unreasonable. As he put it, "I told the DEQ that was the whole point of putting my pig farm right next to the Snake River so that I could dump all that shit in the water." The free market allowed him to do that cost-free. Only the government could force him to pay for those costs or stop altogether from imposing them on the public. That's an externality. Traditionally, orthodox economists have described the phenomenon of externalities, but have treated them as a relatively secondary issue. Could be easily treated with some light government regulation, litigation in the courts by people who were victimized, or some sort of fine. The current global climate change crisis demonstrates that externalities actually can become life-threatening, not just for the small affected populations, but for the biosphere of the entire planet. And if we think more broadly, we can identify a wide array of externalities caused by market economies that seriously call into question whether the economic, political, and social costs of market economies outweigh their virtues. One classically trained economist who has done that broad thinking is a guy named Robin Hanel, who happens to be a good friend of my old boss, Jules Boykoff, and who I have met and talked to several times. A very interesting guy. He describes himself as a market abolitionist and a libertarian socialist who rejects both markets and central planning in favor of what he and other socialists call participatory economics. In an article entitled "The Case Against Markets," Hanel begins by challenging the claim that markets allocate resources efficiently or promote democracy. The widespread and growing presence of monopolies in advanced economies introduces large inefficiencies. Moreover, there are supply and demand dynamics that lead from time to time not to equilibrium, but to disequilibrium that can cause crashes in individual markets, but also crashes in the system as a whole. The Great Depression, the East Asian financial crisis of 25 years ago, and the Great Recession of 2008, 2009 are good examples. These crashes destroy productive forces in the economy, like factories that shut down and workers who are laid off. And these are wildly inefficient consequences of free markets. But Hanel goes beyond purely economic externalities, and quoting another progressive economist, a guy named Samuel Bowles, notes that, quote, our evaluation of markets, and with it the concept of market failure, must be expanded to include the effects of markets on both the structure of power and the process of human development. Bowles notes that the sort of people we become, the sort of cultural habits we develop, are shaped to a great extent by the shape of the economic institutions we live and work in. We are different kinds of people than that guy who confessed to the church leaders that he was guilty of a grave sin for making 6 pence profit on a shilling. We don't function that way anymore. We have become different people because we've been living in market systems for a couple of centuries now. As Hanel puts it, markets reward those who are most efficient at taking advantage of his or her fellow man or woman, and penalize those who insist illogically on pursuing the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Or as Bowles puts it, the economy, its markets, workplaces, and other sites is a gigantic school. We learn to function in these environments, and in so doing, become someone we might not have become in a different setting. Market economies, Bowles says, economize on valuable traits, feelings of solidarity with others, the ability to empathize, the capacity for complex communication and collective decision-making. And in so doing, they contribute to their erosion and even disappearance. My favorite example of this is what has been happening to part-time and temporary contract workers in places like fast food restaurants, and restaurants in general for that matter, and retail trade. As part-timers or contract workers, they get either no medical insurance benefits or very reduced benefits. Their pay is low, but worst of all to me is that they have very little control over their work schedules. They can be called into work on their days off with only a few hours' notice, and their shifts can change radically and unpredictably from 1 month to another, or even 1 week to another. They can be, how do you try to finish your education in this sort of a regime, which many part-time workers are trying to do? How do you raise a family when you have no consistent idea of what your work schedule is, or how long you will be employed, or what you will do in case of a family medical emergency? How do you take on a 30-year mortgage if you're functioning within that kind of environment? When I see this described, or when I used to see my students struggling with this reality, I often ask myself, what sort of world do these employers want to live in? What kind of world do they want their children and their grandchildren to live in? Can't they see how socially destabilizing these practices are? And the answer apparently is they don't care about the social effects. Those are externalities that they don't have to pay for. And the world they want to live in apparently consists of nothing but one that maximizes their profits while generating radical economic and social insecurity for more and more working people in the name of labor market flexibility, the euphemism that market fundamentalists use to describe some of their favorite reforms. One could multiply these situations in today's world endlessly. What about democracy? Well, for Hanel and Bowles, market economies create large economic inequalities that put a huge amount of power in unaccountable multinational companies that shape the daily lives of millions of people around the world, completely outside regular politics and political processes. In fact, they're shaping the world we live in quite a bit more powerfully than our political institutions do. Moreover, the concentration of economic power in both individuals, like the Koch brothers, for example, and large corporations allows them to convert their economic power into political power to block popular reform movements from making any serious structural changes in our economies and societies. Finally, market economies, as mentioned previously, undermine social traits that support democracy, such as the ability to process and communicate complex information, to make collective decisions, and the capacity to feel empathy and solidarity with others. I would add that economic inequality itself also causes all sorts of familiar social pathologies. There's an excellent book called The Spirit Level that's full of data showing that societies that are more unequal, or even within the United States, states that are more unequal than others, have much higher rates of crime, substance abuse and addiction, teen pregnancy, low life expectancy, high infant mortality. Our very health is pretty dramatically affected by inequality. It has pervasive and mostly negative social consequences. Finally, closely related to all this is, for Hanel, is the replacement of an ethic of equitable cooperation with commercial values, leading to a tendency to reduce all human relations to a market relationship, an ethic of how do I extract commercial value from every human relationship. Again, what sort of world do we want to live in? What sort of world do we want our children and grandchildren to live in? How we organize ourselves economically has impacts throughout our society. We used to think about this. Jefferson and Hamilton had a famous argument at the beginning of the Republic about whether we should remain in an agrarian society or industrialize. And Jefferson's objection to Hamilton's ideas about industrializing America weren't that he thought that was inefficient, weren't that he thought that wouldn't lead to growth. It was he didn't like the kind of society that he thought industrialization would provide. He looked at the big cities of Europe, and they were hideous and repulsive, and he didn't want to import that social model into the United States. Now, he was comfortable with slavery, but he did although he was not that comfortable with slavery. He was insistent on slavery, but quite uncomfortable with it. But the debate was not about which is the most efficient economic system to produce the biggest quantity of social goods. It was about what kind of a world do we want to live in? What kind of society do we want to be? We tend not to ask that question today when talking about our economic arrangements. At the end of this critique, Hanel comes to a very radical conclusion. Markets are perhaps the most socially destructive institution ever devised by the human species. Well, but what do you really think? And that's why he has become a market abolitionist. What is to be done then? Hanel himself, as I say, is a self-proclaimed socialist and market abolitionist, but he just as strongly rejects the communist model of central planning as the capitalist model of markets. And he thinks that trying to chase after the pervasive presence of all sorts of externalities through government regulation is a hopeless project. He himself has proposed a complete economic model based on participatory democracy. that relies neither on markets nor on top-down government action. He's done this in two fascinating books titled, one is Economic Justice and Democracy, From Competition to Cooperation, from 2005, and more recently, published in 2022, Participatory Economy, or A Participatory Economy. Even other socialists are skeptical of his participatory solution. A short book I highly recommend if you're interested in social alternatives to our capitalist society is a dialogue between Robin Hahnel and another very prominent, now deceased, socialist sociologist, Eric Olin Wright, who defends a market socialism model with worker-owned enterprises. Their short book together is titled Alternatives to Capitalism, Proposals for a Democratic Economy. Very interesting dialogue between the two of them. And if you prefer a less radical approach from a less radical thinker, America's most eminent and most mainstream post-World War II political scientist, Robert Dahl, wrote a book almost 40 years ago titled A Preface to Economic Democracy, which lays out his idea for democratizing enterprises and the economy without centralizing economic decision-making. And he takes the position that if we do not democratize the economy, it's hard for us to say we really live in a democratic society. For myself, I find Hahnel's critique of markets very persuasive, but I'm skeptical of the proposal to do without them altogether. I'm also persuaded that government regulation exhibits also various forms of pathology, most notably the capture of regulatory agencies by the powerful economic interests they're trying to regulate, and the complexity involved in chasing after the enormous number of externalities generated by market capitalism. I am a fan of incorporating deeper forms of participation into our democratic life and our economic life, but I am also convinced that participatory democracy is also afflicted with vices and pathologies of its own. For me, then, there is no perfect system for designing or managing our economic life and making it more compatible with democracy and a humane society. There are only second-best imperfect mixes of imperfect mechanisms. Markets are powerful tools if used with caution. Government intervention is essential, but has to be carefully supervised to avoid cronyism and agency capture. Democratic participation can provide a useful corrective to the pathologies of markets and governments, but also involves pitfalls and pathologies of its own. We have to constantly experiment with markets, government planning and regulation, and democratic participation to take advantage of the virtues and minimize the pathologies of each of them. And that's an experiment and a compromise that will always be in flux. Reasonable people can have different preferences about the mix and the combination of virtues and vices of each mechanism. My personal preference would be something like Eric Olin Wright, would involve permitting small businesses to operate in competitive markets while abolishing large private corporations and designing an economy with worker-owned and managed businesses operating within a market system with some regulatory oversight from democratic public authority. I think there will always be useful progressive reforms that restrict markets when necessary. And I think there will also always be useful conservative reforms that make greater use of markets in some limited ways. The aim should be to combine the best of all worlds, but that is not at all a simple task, either just conceptually and definitely politically. It's easy to end up creating the worst of all worlds through rotating political power from one form of economic dogmatism to another. One thing is clear, we are currently far from the optimal mix. I think what Hanel's analysis shows, at least it is persuasive to me, is that embracing market fundamentalism and just trying to clear away all the obstacles to free markets and letting them run unchecked as if they are self-correcting is the ultimate fool's gold. Thank you.
That was fascinating, and also, there's so little solution. I mean, the solution is
Muddling through.
yes, yes.
Well, I used to be a radical utopian, but as I've grown older and either less courageous or more wise, I'm not sure which,
I know.
I've become what I sometimes have called a middle-of-the-road extremist, who believes that constant tinkering is our fate, and we're never going to, through constant tinkering, end up with the perfect system. So we have to be constantly re-looking what we have done and identifying its worst pathologies and trying to fix them as best we can, and then review those again in 10 years to see if they've gone sour.
Right. And humans are tinkerers. I mean, that's who we are. We're tinkerers in medicine, in politics, in economy. Wow. Well, I'm sure we're going to have lots of questions. We always do whenever you are the speaker. So,
now, isn't it that patent mechanism is actually giving a monopoly with the support of the government? So there has to be some way to manage that, at least, though it serves certain purposes, but it may be worthwhile perhaps to tax at the same time giving the patent monopoly. What do you think about that?
Rink, I think I hear you say that the government is a monopoly. Am I correct?
No. The government gives a monopoly to the corporation in terms of patents for them to innovate as well as make profit. Now, therefore it is a monopoly the given. Now, should it be taxed in order to sort of control it?
Well, market fundamentalists like Milton Friedman believe that it's not markets that create monopolies, but governments, that governments through miscellaneous rules create monopolies. That doesn't make any sense to me. As I was mentioning, the whole rationale for individual business people is to create a monopoly. That's the way you get to be really successful. And dominate a locality or a whole sector or the world in some cases, like Apple and its products, right? I also believe that being a corporation is a privilege. You can't be a corporation without getting a paper from the government that says you're allowed to be a corporation, so that the officers of the company aren't personally liable for losses, but rather the corporation is, and it can take on the attributes of an artificial person that the Supreme Court has even recognized as having individual rights, like contributing to political campaigns. It used to be in the 19th century, people would talk about this and say, hey, the government has allowed corporations to exist, and therefore it can take that back or modify what it means to be a corporation at will. And I think we should do that. I don't know that simply taxing them is particularly the answer, although certainly they could be taxed more than they are now. Some pay no taxes at all. But I don't think there's any question that corporations are not a natural form of organization that just springs out of the ground. They are created by government, and government has a legitimate right to ask for things back for the privilege of being a corporation.
Thank you, Jeff. We have a question from Friendly House. Our first question number 1.
Yeah, I'm wondering which of those options addresses any kind of steady state, non-growth economy. It seems like that's somewhere that we're going to have to head at some point. Do these address that much?
Well, I mean, I think if you just let free markets go where they will, you'll get more and more growth, which in many ways is a good thing. The Chinese economy has grown enormously in the last 40 years as a result of their economic reforms, and it's lifted like 400 million people out of poverty. That's a good thing. And there's, I don't know, 1 billion or 2 billion people in the world living in absolute poverty. And the solution to that, at least at that local level, is going to have to be economic growth or of some kind. But I don't think, even if you're a fan of eventually bringing everybody up to a minimally decent standard and then having a no growth economy, I don't think that rules out the use of markets to conveniently manage all the millions of transactions that people go through in a modern economy. So you can't get there by just letting free markets go wild, but it does seem to me that that's where you want to go. You can get there through a mix of free markets, government action, and participatory democracy.
Thank you, Jeff. We have let's see, Jules, you're on Zoom.
Oh, no.
I know, but Jules, you got to ask a question.
Hello, Jules.
Oh, hey, I actually didn't know that I was going to get this opportunity, so I appreciate it. What a wonderful lecture, Jeff. You just lay things out so clearly. I guess if you were able to engage in a debate with Robin Hanel, the person that you cited prolifically, what are 2 questions that you'd like him to have to reconcile? I'd love to see a debate between you two great minds. Thank you.
Well, I strongly recommend the book in which he and Eric Olin Wright debate these questions. I read his book on economic democracy as part of a directed study I did with a student some years ago. We were reading all kinds of things about socialism, and we both found his model of an economy that worked completely through participatory democracy implausible. Who's the famous playwright? Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde once commented that socialism was impossible because it would take up too many evenings. Because there would have to be just constant meetings. And Hanel, in his book, is aware of this criticism and tries to show how you could have participatory democracy without having constant meetings. My student and I both found this a little hard to swallow. I mean, he had participatory democracy doing things like figuring out what the proper level of pollutants from a factory should be. Well, this is a highly technical, scientific question, among other things, that ordinary citizens without the necessary technical training are in no position to discuss intelligently and decide democratically. The most egalitarian democratic society needs specialized expertise and needs a public that respects specialized expertise. So he goes to great lengths in very interesting ways to show how he's limiting, you only have to decide a few critical things, and that democratic participation would be a feasible way to do that. But it sounded highly implausible to me. So I would go after that notion that participatory democracy by itself can be a full-scale model for running an entire modern complex economy.
We have 2 Jules in our audience. The Jules number 2, I think it's Jules. Can you unmute and come on in on Zoom?
Yes.
Thank you.
2 quick questions.
One question, everybody.
Okay,
One question.
one question. Unionism, is that a way to increase participatory democracy? And why is it squelched by these corporations that close their venues rather than deal with the organizational efforts to unionize that shop? How do you get around that obligation?
Absolutely, unionism can be part of the answer. I used to think that we can move towards a more egalitarian society by, in a big way, doing things like tax the rich and somehow reducing the power that they have. That seems less and less viable politically. The alternative is to build up the power of non-corporate people and encouraging union, one of the best ways to do that. I mean, we just saw how the auto workers union brought the big automobile manufacturers to their knees and got a very good settlement. No such settlement would have occurred without the union.
Exactly.
And in the United States, unions have declined radically. At the end of the 50s, something like 35% of the private workforce in America was unionized. And we had lots of strikes. But we also had a much more egalitarian society in 1960 than we have now, economically, at least. Now, less than 10% of private workers are unionized.
Exactly.
The biggest unions now are among government employees. And I read the other day that although unions last year won a lot of big strikes, they won against medical organizations, automobile companies, and others. The proportion of workers who belong to unions actually fell slightly. We have the lowest proportion of unionized workers in the developed world. In Europe, it's still the case that 20, 30, in the case of some Scandinavian countries, close to 50% of workers are unionized. And it's one reason Europe is much more equal economically than we are. And it's also a reason why CEO salaries in other countries are nothing like what they are here. In the 1950s, the average CEO made something like 30 times the wage of the worker in his company. Now it's 350 times. Well, that's not true anywhere else. You know, in Japan, it's like 20 to 1. In Europe, it's, 50 or 60 to 1. We have constructed rules of the game that permit that kind of inequality. And other rules of the game are possible because we see other countries implementing different rules of the game and getting different consequences, including longer life expectancy and reduced infant mortality.
Thank you, Jeff.
So does employee?
Nope. Jules,
Oh, okay.
we have our next from Friendly House, Al Christians.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you create the right environment, the capitalists are very cutthroat. They'll stab each other in the back. Or why not progressive income tax on corporations, where the largest corporations have to pay the highest tax rates, give them a great incentive to split up?
I'm all in favor of that. I mean, other things that have been talked about, but we haven't exactly done, is to say, set a limit on CEO compensation. And say, you only get $10 million a year would be the max. That would be a radical reduction from current practices. And if you pay anything over that, as they do in the NBA or the NFL, you have to pay a luxury tax if you pay your CEOs more than a fixed amount. And if it's a lot more, then a lot more. I don't know if you saw the other day, a court invalidated Elon Musk's compensation package. He had a compensation package that was going to give him, $55 billion.
Yeah.
over a limited number of years. And they said, no, you can't do that.
Yeah.
At least you can't do it in the way that you did it. You'd have to get a vote of all the stockholders or something to do that. So he's working on coming up with a new way of giving himself that kind of package. Well, that's just absurd. You know, what are we thinking that we would permit rules of the game that allow billions of dollars to flow into the pockets of yacht builders?
Thank you, Jeff. We got a question from Todd on Zoom. Come on in, Todd, and please ask your question.
Thank you, Jeff. Great to see you. A couple of weeks ago, I was at a meeting called the Californians for the Well-Being Economy, similar to the Happiness Index internationally. It seems like a good idea, but I'm not sure how it translates to an economic structure. Can you enlighten me a little bit on this?
Well, you know, they do surveys of what country has the population that's happiest in the world. And consistently, the countries that score highest on the happiness scale are the Scandinavian countries: Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden. Why? Because their social safety network has largely eliminated economic insecurity. They are not radically equal societies, although they're much more equal than the United States is, but people aren't constantly stressed out over whether their whole family life and their whole economic situation is going to collapse into catastrophe, which many, I can say a majority of families in the United States feel. I think it's one reason that people have commented on how the economy has been improving radically in the last year or two, but Biden isn't getting any credit for it. And a whole lot of people are still saying the economy is bad and getting worse. And part of that is just sheer partisanship. You know, Republicans don't want to give a Democratic president credit for anything. But part of it, I think, also is growth is doing well, employment is up, but economic insecurity in the workplace, the way people are organized and managed, as I was describing with part-time workers, is making everybody feel like, wow, I'm one bad event away from catastrophe. Another example that I'm aware of is at Intel, their high-paid engineers and so forth are no longer permanent employees. They're contract employees. And a contract lasts for 6 months, maybe a year on a given project. And when it's over, you're unemployed. And you have to go find another project in the company that will hire you for another contract. And maybe no one will. And as you get older and expect more and more pay, fewer and fewer are going to sign you up for the next project. So you have no idea whether you're going to get another gig at the end of this project, or whether you have a year or two of unemployment, or whether you're never going to find a job again in Intel, and maybe not somewhere else. Well, no, the economy is not good if that's the environment that you're living in, because it's not providing you with a fundamental base of security around which you can plan a life and raise a family. So, I mean, that's just one example of things that can be done. Another big bugaboo of mine is, in terms of design, home life and work life and school life are not coordinated in any way. And there's lots of things you could do so that people can have more flexible work schedules that they control, so that they can arrange to be with their kids, to take them to school and pick them up after school. That schools would have much more in the way of after-school activities that kids could engage in. All kinds of stuff. My wife was employed full-time as a systems programmer while we were raising our child. And I was a college professor. One reason that worked was that as a college professor, I could make my schedule pretty much the way I wanted to. And so I never taught classes after, that ended after 2:30 or something. So I could go home and pick up my daughter from school. I had summer vacations off, so I could, be with her and do things and take her to and from summer camps and do whatever. Most people don't have the flexibility that a college professor has, but we could create more flexibility, more patterns of work so that people could design, but then they've got to be stable. It can't be, oh, this is a really convenient work schedule I have for the next 6 weeks, but I have no idea what it's going to be at the end of that six weeks. And people talk about this from time to time, but we don't do anything about it. And so making work, school, and home mesh together, I don't think that would be terribly inefficient, but it would improve the lives of people radically and improve parents' ability to raise their kids in a humane way.
Thank you, Jeff. We've got a question from the audience. Go ahead, Hank.
So the all-knowing internet on my phone here tells me that Adam Smith declared, "People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment or diversion. But the conversations ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices." My question is, why do we never hear that quote from Adam Smith?
Well, we do occasionally. It's important to note that he was talking about trade unions, not companies. He was talking about the guilds in that passage, actually, but it is a more general principle. There's another passage in Adam Smith where he's talking about how pernicious it is for the government to give privileges to businesses and things because it interferes with the free competition that he wants. And so he's got a passage where he essentially says, he goes through a thing and says, landowners' interests are in the same vein as the public interest because they want the value of land to increase, and economic growth does that. Workers' interests are aligned with the public good because higher wages create better welfare for everybody. Businessmen's interests, however, are not aligned with the public good. This is Adam Smith, and therefore don't let them anywhere near the parliament. Because if you do, they will extract from the parliament privileges that run against the public interest. It's a really interesting passage. It's not exactly an anti-business sentiment. It's a businessmen's selfishness will work great if it's confined to the economy. But don't let them use that influence in the government. In that sense, if he were consistent, he would be appalled by the way business interests today hover around the parliament all the time, extracting all kinds of privileges.
Thank you, Jeff. Gretchen, come on in from Zoom. You'll be next.
I'm glad that the conversation got around to Adam Smith. When he was writing in his early days, and he was just looking at riches coming out of West Indies, and he was writing later, did he write enough and in detail enough about the moral obligations of business people once he'd seen the slavery results that accompanied that profit? Did he write enough, and could people who are more progressive start quoting Adam Smith in his later years?
One of the best courses I ever took in graduate school was we spent a whole semester reading Marx's Capital and Smith's The Wealth of Nations. Didn't read anything else, no commentaries, nothing. We just went through the text. There's all kinds of interesting stuff in Smith. One of the weird things, he has a passage about inequality in which he says, You know, the difference between a rich man and a poor man at birth is not very significant. But one grows up in an atmosphere that expands his abilities and helps him flower, and the other one doesn't. And he has a passage about the effect of being a worker in a factory that is as strident in its description of how damaging factory life is to workers than anything you can find in Marx. And he basically says factory life, the division of labor and working in a factory like that will turn you into such a cretin that you won't even be useful as cannon fodder for the military. But then he doesn't propose to do anything about this, you know, except he says, well, it would be good to have a little public education, but mainly to teach people basic arithmetic and obedience to authority, so that they'll be better factory workers, and in politics will defer to their social betters. So that's his solution. But he's completely on the side of nurture in the nature-nurture debate. And he's completely aware of how damaging and debilitating early factory work is. And he just sort of says, well, that's one of the prices you pay for all the benefits you get from a market economy. So there is some very interesting tension between his economic theories and his ethical outlook.
Thank you. Let's get our next questioner, number 4.
About 1/6 of our economy is the medical system, and I think that's one of the great market failures of our economy. Some of it is information asymmetry. If you're in an accident, you don't get bids from different ambulance services. But a lot of it is, it seems to me, just inefficiencies and multiple layers and an enormous bureaucracy that's built around.
You got to ask.
Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well,
thank you.
You know, market fundamentalists are constantly trying to introduce markets into medical care as the solution to all these problems. But remember what the ideal market system requires: perfect competition and complete and instant information for everybody. Well, in the medical system, you know, you're usually kind of locked into a particular system, and the patients are never going to have complete information about the doctors. It's very difficult for a patient to assess the quality of medical care provided by a particular doctor. So market models notoriously are a poor fit in the medical system. But there are lots of universal healthcare systems around the world that work pretty well. My own favorite, I used to teach a course on the politics of healthcare, comparative politics of healthcare. The French system, I think, has been pretty terrific. It's expensive, and they're constantly worrying about trying to contain costs, but they are able to contain costs much better than we do, where we don't have any cost containment policies that work very well. We just got the worst hodgepodge of healthcare. There are plenty of models out there. The Japanese system works pretty well. The German system works pretty well. The Scandinavian systems work pretty well. The British system does not work pretty well.
It strikes me that the incentives for insurance companies are especially perverse.
They're terrible. They're the incentives of insurance companies or for health maintenance organizations is to provide as little care as possible and charge as much as possible for it. Right. I mean, one of the good things about Obamacare was it said, no, you can't stop covering people because they got sick. Mm-hmm. And no, you can't refuse to insure people because of pre-existing conditions. Mm-hmm. You know, if anybody needs health care, it's people with pre-existing conditions, right? So I want to move to Uruguay, as I've told many of you. In fact, I'm planning to do it later this year. Wow. They've got a universal health care system, and the facilities aren't great, but the quality of the doctors and the Medicare is pretty high, and everybody's included, and it includes all your prescriptions. And as an expat, if I'm a permanent resident, I'll be able to join it and pay for this complete medical care, the outrageous sum of $70 a month. You know, well, if,
Yeah.
and all these countries that I'm talking about have better life expectancies than the US. And I think Uruguay's life expectancy, even though it's a somewhat less developed society, is about the same as the United States. So we have made this an incredibly complex problem. Donald Trump famously said while they were working on the alternative to Obamacare that never arrived, he said, "Who knew that healthcare and health insurance were so complicated?" Well, everybody but him knew it. But in the United States, we've made it much more complicated than it needs to be. And we should just look around the world for models of how to do it better.
Quick question. Safeway, Sherry's, Costco, they're all union shops. I talked to the kids that work there, and most of them are not part of the union. They don't work enough hours to be in the union. And they're miserable. They think the government sucks. And they're flirting with, Trump, not because they go along with him, but because it's like throwing a rock in the gears.
Yeah.
So the union's dropping the ball, and I was a union person most of my life.
Yeah.
Well, the question is the union is not the answer. Is that?
Well, I think unions are a part of the answer, but unions have a lot of blood on their hands in our history as well. A lot of unions were incredibly racist. I did a documentary when I worked for public television in Seattle about Black youth unemployment in Seattle. And one reason that Black unemployment was higher in Seattle is that the construction unions had systematically excluded Black people from their membership up into the 70s and beyond. And this was true in a lot of construction trades around the country. Some unions were terribly corrupt. So you want to expand unionization, but in good unions. And you want to make it possible for unions to represent everybody in a workplace and not just a privileged few. I mean, this was the great innovation, the old AFL in the 1910s, 1920s. Its members were sort of the privileged elite of the working class, and they organized trade by trade. When the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, came along in the 30s, their great innovation was, we're going to organize whole plants where all the different trades are going to be in a single union, and everybody's going to be in the union. And then we're going to try and make this an industry-wide union. And so you got the United Auto Workers and the steel workers and the mine workers and the rubber workers and this and that. And that was a huge expansion of union membership, but also a much more inclusive model of unionizations. Over the last 30 or 40 years, racist practices in the unions have been pretty well, shut down. And so they're much more racially inclusive than there. But no big institution like that is going to be free of pathologies if you just sort of let it develop its own internal dynamics without any external vision and supervision, not
Well,
even professors.
Dale, go ahead if you want to ask your question.
Yeah. Do you think that patents promote monopolies?
Well, patents are by definition a monopoly. They give you an exclusive right to produce this thing that you've invented for however many years. Patents are actually, in the high-tech world, patents are becoming less important because the innovation is happening so fast that your product becomes obsolete long before your patent runs out. And so the patent is essentially useless. And I think patents and copyrights are good. I think they promote innovation. They give income streams to authors and artists and things in the copyright realm. They just can't, they shouldn't be abused. And so again, they're a tool that can, if used properly, can promote and reward innovation, but they can also be abused and do nothing but create a monopoly where maybe there shouldn't be one. So, and people try to patent all kinds of things. People are going to the Amazon jungle and finding new substances that are chemically useful and trying to patent the plant, basically. And developing countries are fighting back about this and say, hey, that stuff is not plants' chemical properties are not patentable, and you're essentially stealing our potential wealth for developing these resources. So that's an area where patent can be destructive, it seems to me.
Dave Gray has typed in a question. What do you think of stock markets? Is it a beneficial part of the market? He looks at it as people buying them just to make money, greed, or a boost to society.
I am highly in favor of stock markets when my stocks are going up.
Yes.
I've noticed I'm less fond of them when my stocks are going down. No, stock markets are a really important part of a market economy. There are ways for companies to raise money, to invest in innovation and the like, but they can be highly corrupt and dishonest. We created the Securities and Exchange Commission in the 1930s because of all the ridiculous abuses that had gone on, all the fraud and cheating and insider trading and so forth. And so they too need regulation. These days, the regulation isn't very stout because the market players are very powerful and there's so many transactions, and the SEC tends to be years behind in identifying and running after abuses, and people are becoming cleverer and cleverer about insider tradings. But every once in a while, they catch Martha Stewart.
Yeah, they catch Martha Stewart.
And sometimes they catch really big fish too. Personally, and this doesn't have too much to do with the honesty of it, but one of the things that I'm in favor of to create a more egalitarian world is to tax financial transactions. And you don't have to tax them very much. You tax them at 1/100th of 1%. And it adds up to like $1 trillion a year if you do this worldwide. And it doesn't really create much friction in the markets, except it does somewhat inhibit mass programmed trading. And that's probably a good thing, because mass programmed trading has tended to destabilize markets and accentuate market ups and downs. But boy, I think that's a terrific way. And that tax would tend to fall on more affluent people because they're the ones engaged in financial transactions.
Good. This is going to be our final question from the audience.
In the back and forth dialogue, exploring the question of what kind of society do we want to live in, was it Jefferson and Hamilton? And do you have, off the top of your head, a couple of 2 or 3, 4 papers that I could search to if I wanted to read some of this dialogue? Can you
There's
tell me
a
where to
great
begin?
book by Michael Sandel, Sandel, that's called either Democracy's Discontents or Democracy and Its Discontents. And he has 2 or 3 chapters where he goes through the economic history of the United States from the point of view of the debates that people were having about what kind of a society do we want to live in, and therefore what would be the best economic arrangements to have that kind of society. And so he covers the Jefferson-Hamilton debates, but also, anti-slavery debates and the New Deal, and it's sort of, he's got 3 or 4 chapters that trace the debates that we used to have over concerns about the way our economic system was creating a certain kind of society. And one of the reasons for democracy's discontents, he maintains, is we've stopped having those debates. We just let societies become whatever it is they're going to become, and then lament how bad things are, without saying, you know, this should be a collective public decision. What sort of economic arrangements do we want to have so that we create the kind of social world that we want to live in and that we want our kids and grandkids to live in? Wonderful book.
Yeah, Jeff, we've run out of time, and to hear the news that you're really making plans this year to head to Ecuador, Uruguay.
I was going to leave in April, but I've postponed that. I'm now planning to leave in mid-August.
Mid-August. So I know we have a few more programs that you're going to do with this series. So informative. Thank you so much for taking the time. And
More than welcome. I really enjoy coming here.
we enjoy your speeches, and we enjoy your program. Thank you so much.
Thank you.